Friends, thank you for being here today. We find ourselves at a moment in our nation's history that demands not just our attention, but our deepest understanding. We are witnessing something that many of us thought we would never see in our lifetimes. For the first time in his presidency, Donald Trump is not fighting the Democrats. He's not fighting the media. He is fighting his own party. And when I say he is fighting his party, I'm not talking about the usual whispers in the hallways of the Capitol or the anonymous quotes given to reporters in the shadows. I'm talking about something far more significant. I'm talking about Republican senators, men and women who have stood by the president through thick and thin, suddenly standing up, casting votes against him on the Senate floor, and drawing a constitutional line in the sand. To understand why this is happening, and why it is happening right now, we have to look past the daily noise of the cable news cycle. We have to look at the fundamental machinery of our republic. We have to ask ourselves, why would loyal allies suddenly move to check the power of a president from their own party? The answer lies in three specific events that have collided at once: a reckless military threat against a NATO ally, a questionable emergency declaration over foreign oil, and a crisis of accountability that has left Washington in the dark. But more than that, this is a story about the difference between the rule of law and the instincts of one man. For those of us who have watched the American political landscape for decades, who remember the Cold War, who remember Vietnam, and who remember the importance of steady leadership, this moment is a stress test. It is a test of whether our institutions can hold. Before we go further, I want to ask you, have you sensed this shift in the party too? Or does it still feel like business as usual to you? Let me know in the comments as we dive in. To understand exactly what is happening, we need to begin by identifying the breaking point. Let us start with the facts, clean and simple. Recently, we saw Republican senators join with Democrats to advance the War Powers Resolution. Now, War Powers Resolution sounds like a technical term, the kind of dry legislative language that makes eyes glaze over. But I want to tell you that this vote was anything but dry. It was not symbolic. It was not a gesture. It was a direct message from the legislative branch to the executive branch. The message was this: you do not get to start wars alone. This vote did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because the president has been openly, publicly, and repeatedly suggesting military action against Greenland. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Greenland? Is this a joke? That was the initial reaction of many. But it became clear very quickly that this was not a joke. It was not a negotiation tactic. It was a real option being considered inside the Oval Office. This is where we have to pause and look at the map. Greenland is not some unclaimed, empty territory sitting in the Arctic waiting to be claimed like land in the 19th century. Greenland belongs to Denmark. Denmark is not an adversary. Denmark is a founding member of NATO. For those of us who remember the founding of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, we know that it operates on one sacred principle: collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. This has been the bedrock of Western security for 75 years. It is the reason the Soviet Union never rolled tanks through the Fulda Gap. It is the reason Europe has known peace for decades. So, when an American president starts floating military options against the territory of a NATO ally, it is not just unusual. It is constitutionally and internationally explosive. It suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of what an alliance means. You do not conquer your friends. You do not threaten the sovereign territory of the people who have fought and died alongside your soldiers. Senator Susan Collins, a moderate Republican who has often tried to bridge the divide, was reportedly on the receiving end of a very harsh phone call from the president after she voted for this resolution. The reporting tells us the language was brutal. The message was unmistakable: loyalty or consequences. But here is what is different this time. She didn't back down. Neither did the other Republicans who crossed the aisle. They looked at the stakes, they looked at the threats, and they decided that the Constitution was more important than the phone call. I want to hear from you on this. Do you think the president was right to demand loyalty, or were these senators right to vote their conscience? Drop a comment below. I read them all. This brings us to the historical context: the ghost of 1973 and the War Powers Act. To truly understand why Republicans are willing to break with Trump on this issue, we have to go back in time. We have to remember where the War Powers Act came from. This isn't some obscure procedural rule invented to annoy a Republican president. The War Powers Act was passed in 1973. Think back to where we were as a country in 1973. We were coming out of the long, painful tragedy of Vietnam. We had watched an entire generation of young American men sent to war based on executive decisions that largely bypassed democratic debate. We watched as mission creep turned into a quagmire. In 1973, Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, said never again. They passed this law to require presidents to consult Congress before committing military forces. It limits how long troops can remain deployed without legislative authorization. It is a constitutional safeguard. It is there to ensure that if we send our sons and grandsons into harm's way, it is because the American people, through their representatives, have agreed to it. So, when Trump started publicly discussing military options for Greenland, lawmakers didn't hear a bold foreign policy strategy. They heard alarm bells. They heard the echoes of history warning them that unchecked executive power leads to disaster. Greenland is home to Thule Air Base. This is one of the most critical installations in America's missile defense network. It is our eyes and ears in the Arctic. We maintain that base, not through conquest, but through cooperation. We are there because Denmark invites us to be there. If we threaten Denmark, we don't just look like bullies. We risk losing that base. We risk shattering NATO credibility overnight. And here's the number that should keep us all up at night. NATO, as Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, has been invoked exactly once in the alliance's 75-year history. Do you remember when that was? It was after September 11th, 2001. When America was attacked, Europe stood up. They said, "We are with you." Their soldiers fought and died alongside ours in Afghanistan. If the United States is perceived as threatening a NATO member now, that unity collapses. European defense cooperation deteriorates. Intelligence sharing, which depends entirely on trust, gets jeopardized. And who benefits from that chaos? Russia? China? Iran? They would seize that propaganda victory before the ink dried on the headlines. This is why Republicans are moving against the president. They realize that his mindset, which processes foreign policy like a real estate deal involving leverage and dominance, is fundamentally incompatible with the delicate web of alliances that keeps America safe. While military alliances are crucial, we must also confront the emergency powers trap. While the fight over war powers was dominating the headlines, something else slipped through that deserves just as much scrutiny. The president declared a national emergency over Venezuelan oil assets. On paper, the administration sold this as a move to secure energy assets and protect American interests against a hostile regime. It sounds reasonable enough in a soundbite. But we have to look closer. We have to look at the reality on the ground. Venezuela's oil infrastructure has been in ruins for years. Decades of socialism, mismanagement, sanctions, and underinvestment have gutted it. Experts tell us that rebuilding that sector would take 10 years minimum and tens of billions of dollars in capital. So who actually benefits from this emergency declaration? It certainly isn't the American consumer. It isn't the family trying to fill up their gas tank in Ohio or Florida. The primary winners would be multinational energy. Corporations, the only entities with the massive capital and expertise required to extract and refine Venezuela's heavy crude. We are talking about global companies whose profits do not necessarily flow back to American workers or American communities. But the real issue for Republican lawmakers isn't just the oil. It is the precedent. We have seen this president lean on emergency powers repeatedly. He used them for border wall funding when Congress refused to appropriate the money. He used them for trade restrictions. Now he is using them for foreign oil assets. Each time a president uses an emergency to bypass Congress, the threshold for what qualifies as an emergency gets lower. The scope of presidential action gets wider. Republicans are finally noticing the trap. They are realizing that today's emergency president becomes tomorrow's normal. Once you normalize the idea that a president can seize assets or spend money without Congress just by saying the word "part emergency," that power doesn't vanish when your party loses the White House. It sits there, waiting for the next person. Every Republican voting to expand these powers has to ask themselves a very hard question. Do I want a future Democratic president wielding the same authority? Do I want a future president using emergency powers to enact gun control, or the Green New Deal, or to seize healthcare industries? Because that is exactly what they are building. They are building a loaded weapon that can be picked up by anyone who walks into the Oval Office. The revolt we are seeing is a recognition that the Constitution's separation of powers exists to protect us from all tyrants, regardless of which party they belong to. This is a critical point, and I'm curious where you stand. Does the idea of a future Democratic president having these same emergency powers worry you? Tell me yes or no in the comments and explain why. This pattern reveals a deliberate strategy of distraction and a troubling loss of accountability. Now, layer in the third crisis, accountability. President Trump campaigned explicitly on transparency. He promised to drain the swamp. He promised to release classified documents. He set expectations high. But months into his term, the results simply do not match the rhetoric. Timelines have slipped. Reviews have stretched on endlessly. Lawmakers like Senator Sheldon Whitehouse are now publicly asking why. They are asking why Inspector General reviews have stalled. They're asking why transparency commitments keep slipping. These aren't conspiracy theories. They are questions about process failure. And process matters. Process is the difference between a government that works for the people and a government that hides from them. Here is where we connect the dots. A pattern has emerged that is impossible to ignore. Every time oversight pressure increases, every time Congress gets close to seeing documents or getting answers, the president escalates the external drama. Suddenly, war threats get louder. Suddenly, an emergency is declared. The news cycle floods with new controversies. The underlying accountability questions get buried under a mountain of spectacle. This isn't accidental. It is a strategy. It is a strategy to flood the zone, to exhaust the opposition, and to make it impossible for anyone to focus on one issue long enough to hold the administration accountable. But Congress is not a television audience. It is not an audience that gets bored and changes the channel. It is a co-equal branch of government. It has subpoena power. It has budget authority. And it has institutional memory. Some Republicans are remembering that they have power too. They are remembering that their oath is not to the president, but to the Constitution. That realization is what is driving this revolt. It is not driven by ideology. It is not driven by a desire for partisan gain. It is driven by the cold recognition that if they don't defend institutional limits now, those limits won't exist later. But let us bring this home to kitchen table economics and discuss why this matters to you personally. I know that sometimes Washington politics can feel abstract. We talk about war powers and Article 5 and emergency declarations, and it can feel very far removed from our daily lives. So let me bring it down to earth. Let's talk about what this means for you, for your family, and for your retirement. Who actually gets hurt when power concentrates and institutions weaken? It isn't the politicians. It isn't the billionaires. It is American families. Right now, people across this country are watching their president threaten military action against allies, while inflation remains stubbornly high and grocery bills haven't dropped. Remember the core promise that attracted millions of voters to Trump? It was economic security. It was no new wars. That promise is colliding with a reality that looks very different. Voters do not separate foreign policy from kitchen table economics. We understand that instability abroad threatens stability at home. Think about your retirement account. Think about your 401k or your pension. The stock market hates uncertainty. If markets panic over the idea of NATO fracturing, retirement accounts take the hit. If the European economy destabilizes because of a trade war or a security crisis, American companies that sell goods to Europe lose money. That means your stocks go down. Think about the small business owner in your town. They depend on stability. They need to know what the price of goods will be next month. They need to know that supply chains are reliable. When the American president threatens military action against Allied territory, uncertainty spikes. You can hit T-plan investments when you don't know if the world order is about to flip upside down. If a small manufacturing firm in Ohio exports parts to Europe and NATO credibility collapses, European partners start hedging. They start looking for other suppliers. They diversify away from American vendors. The damage isn't a single dramatic headline. It is a slow erosion of contracts, jobs, and revenue over months and years. And then there's the cost of capital. Financial institutions look at emergency power precedents, and they worry about the rule of law. If the rules can change overnight because of a presidential decree, investing becomes riskier. When risk increases, interest rates go up. Those costs get passed to consumers. I'd love to know your story. Are you feeling the impact of this instability at the grocery store or in your business? Share your experience in the comments. So, when we see Republicans pushing back against the president, they are not just debating legal theories. They are trying to protect the economic stability that allows the middle class to survive. They know that chaos is a tax on growth. It is a tax that doesn't show up on your pay stub, but you pay it every time prices go up because the markets are nervous. Beyond the immediate economic pain, we must look deeper into the soul of the party and the long shadow these actions cast. This brings me to a subject that is often whispered about in quiet corners, but rarely spoken of aloud. The erosion of the conservative soul and the terrifying precedent we are setting for the future. For generations, the Republican Party was built on a foundation of specific, immutable principles. We were the party of limited government. We were the party that believed the executive branch had become too bloated, too powerful, and too intrusive. We believed in fiscal responsibility, in the sanctity of contracts, and in the idea that the government should not pick winners and losers in the marketplace. But look at what is happening with the Venezuela emergency declaration. When a president uses emergency powers to seize control of foreign assets and effectively direct the flow of energy markets without congressional approval, that is not conservatism. That is central planning. That is the very definition of the big government overreach that conservatives have fought against since the days of Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan. There are senators in that chamber right now, men and women who cut their teeth on the Reagan Revolution, who are looking at this and realizing that they are voting for policies they spent their entire careers opposing. They are realizing that in the pursuit of short-term political wins, they are dismantling the philosophical guardrails that define the party. And this leads to the moral hazard of our foreign policy. For decades, the United States dollar has been the world's reserve currency. This is not a God-given right. It is a privilege earned through trust. The world holds dollars because they trust the United States as a nation of laws, not men. They trust that property rights are sacred here. They trust that we don't seize assets on a whim. This exorbitant privilege of the dollar is what allows us to run deficits without collapsing. It keeps your interest rates lower. It keeps the cost of imported goods, from your car to your coffee to your medication, affordable. But when an American administration begins to act transactionally, threatening to seize oil, threatening allies, treating treaties like disposable napkins, the trust evaporates. If global investors start to believe that the U.S. acts impulsively, they will slowly move their money elsewhere, perhaps to the euro, perhaps to gold. If the dollar loses its standing as the world's reserve currency, the economic impact on American seniors would be catastrophic. It would mean a permanent spike in inflation that no Social Security cost of living adjustment could ever match. It would decimate fixed incomes. This is the hidden danger of abandoning the rule of law in foreign policy. It isn't just about diplomatic feelings. It's about the value of the money in your bank account. But there is a darker nightmare that is haunting the Republican caucus, and it is the reason this revolt is happening now. It is the fear of the boomerang effect. I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine it is January 2029. A new president has just been inaugurated. But this time, it is a progressive Democrat, perhaps someone further to the left than anyone we have seen before. Imagine that this new president declares a national climate emergency. Citing the precedent set by President Trump with Venezuelan oil and the border wall, this new president decides to bypass Congress entirely. They sign an executive order seizing control of American energy companies to transition them to green energy. They ban gasoline-powered cars by executive fiat, claiming it is an emergency for public health. They halt all fracking immediately. Republicans in Congress would scream. They would rush to the television cameras. They would cry out, "This is unconstitutional. You cannot seize private industry. You cannot bypass the legislature." And do you know what that Democratic president would say? They would simply point to the history books. They would point to 2024 and 2025. They would say, "You established this power. You voted for it. You normalized the use of emergency declarations to bypass Congress when you wanted to seize oil and build walls. I'm just using the tools you left for me." And the courts? The courts rely on precedent. If the Supreme Court upholds Trump's use of these powers now, they will have a very hard time striking down a Democratic president's use of them later. Ask yourself, are we handing a loaded weapon to the next administration? Let MES discuss this in the comments. I am seeing a lot of you already worried about this scenario. This is the nightmare scenario. By empowering the executive branch to act like a king today, Republicans are forging the sword that will be used to cut them down tomorrow. They are handing a loaded weapon to their political opponents. The senators who are standing up, the ones voting for the War Powers Resolution, the ones demanding oversight, they are not traitors or rhinos, Republicans in name only. They are the ones with the foresight to see the trap. They understand that you cannot cheer for a dictator just because he's your dictator, because eventually the other side will get a turn. Furthermore, we must talk about the Senate itself. The Founding Fathers designed the Senate to be the cooling saucer of the Republic. It was meant to be the place where passions cooled, where deliberation happened, and where the interests of the individual states were protected. By bypassing the Senate, by governing through executive orders and emergency declarations, the president is rendering the states voiceless. If a president can decide war and peace or trade and commerce without the Senate, then he is deciding it without the input of Pennsylvania or Arizona or Georgia. He is centralizing power in Washington, D.C. in a way that betrays the very federalist structure of our Constitution. This revolt is, in many ways, the institution of the Senate fighting for its life. It is senators realizing that if they become merely a rubber stamp for the White House, they have betrayed the oath they took, not to a man, but to the Constitution. And let's not forget the quiet influence of the military leadership. While they do not speak politically, the signals from the old guard, the retired generals, the men who served under Mattis and Kelly, are clear. These are men who dedicated their lives to the stability of the global order. They know that alliances like NATO are force multipliers. They know that you cannot secure America by making it an island. When these military leaders see a commander-in-chief treating Article 5 like a bargaining chip, they see a threat to the safety of the troops they once commanded. The Republican Party has always been the party of the military, the party of national defense. To see that relationship frayed is a trauma that goes deep into the party's DNA. So when you see these headlines, when you see the anger and the tweets and the accusations of betrayal, I want you to remember this. The Republicans fighting Trump right now are not trying to destroy the party. They are trying to save its soul. They are trying to ensure that conservative still means something other than loyal to one man. They are trying to ensure that when the political winds shift, and they always do, the American Republic is still standing, with its checks and balances intact, ready to weather the next storm. They are fighting for the principle that the law applies to everyone, from the pauper to the president, Because without that principle, we do not have a country. We just have a power struggle. Given these stakes, we must look at the road ahead. So, where does this go from here? I won't pretend to predict the future, but I can outline the possibilities. In the next 30 to 90 days, this Republican resistance will likely intensify. The War Powers Resolution vote was a signal, a shot across the bow. It showed that the president's grip on the party is slipping when it comes to matters of national security and the Constitution. We are going to see more oversight requests. We are going to see more pushback on emergency declarations. And sadly, we are almost certainly going to see the president escalate his rhetoric. He will frame dissent as sabotage. He will demand loyalty. But the senators who voted against him have already crossed the Rubicon. They have already taken the angry phone calls. They have already faced the threats. At this point, backing down offers them no protection. It only shows weakness. The real test will come in the next 6 to 12 months. Can institutions hold? Can Congress maintain its discipline? Can the courts adjudicate these emergency power challenges without becoming partisan battlegrounds? If Republican resistance holds, we could see a genuine rebalancing. We could see executive power checked and congressional authority reasserted. We could see a return to the norms that have governed our republic for centuries. But if it collapses, if these senators fold under pressure, we are watching a presidency that operates beyond institutional limits. We are watching the setting of precedents that will shape American governance for decades. To wrap this up, friends, I want to leave you with a final thought. Republicans are pushing back against Trump not out of disloyalty, but out of alarm. They are seeing the collision of war powers, emergency declarations, and accountability failures, and they are being forced to choose between party loyalty and institutional survival. This fight over Greenland, over Venezuela, over documents, it isn't just political drama. It is a constitutional crisis over whether the president is above the law. Democracy doesn't protect itself. It is not a machine that runs on autopilot. It relies on people. It relies on lawmakers, judges, and voters who are willing to defend it when it is inconvenient, when it is uncomfortable, and when it is politically risky. The defense is happening right now on the floor of the Senate. Whether it succeeds depends on whether enough people are paying attention. It depends on whether we, the people, understand that the rules that govern power must always be stronger than the people who hold it. So, here's what I want to know from you. When institutions get tested like this, what matters more, spectacle or stability? Do you think Republicans will hold the line or fold under pressure? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and they shape how I approach these stories. And if this breakdown helped you understand what is actually happening beyond the headlines, please consider sharing it with a friend who needs to hear this. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next one.